The courthouse was unusually crowded that morning, every seat taken, every eye darting nervously between the defendant and the bench. Word of this case had spread quickly through the town, and people wanted to witness what many believed would be one of the most important trials in recent memory. The crime had been brutal, shocking even seasoned detectives. But despite months of investigation, the evidence had remained frustratingly thin. The prosecution needed something powerful, something undeniable, to break the case wide open. At the center of it all sat a figure no one expected to play a role, a toddler. Barely 3 years old, she was the youngest presence in the room, sitting quietly in a wooden chair beside her guardian. Her little shoes dangled above the floor, unable to reach it, her gaze drifting absently, as though she didn't understand the weight of the moment. She clutched a soft stuffed bear against her chest, its fabric worn from endless nights of holding it too tightly. To the casual observer, she was just a child. To those who knew her story, she was the fragile thread, holding the entire case together. The girl hadn't spoken a word since the night of the crime. Officers who found her described her as terrified beyond comprehension. She'd been discovered in a derelict house, hiding under a table, her small body trembling so hard that even when she was lifted into safe arms, the shivering didn't stop. Her silence wasn't stubbornness, it was shock. Trauma had stolen her voice. Doctors explained it as selective mutism, the mind's way of protecting itself from unbearable memories. Nobody knew when or if she would speak again. And yet, here she was, in a courtroom thick with tension, with people whispering in the back rows and reporters scribbling notes. Every camera lens, every curious gaze, eventually shifted toward her. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She sat in stillness, too young to realize the weight of the trial, yet old enough to sense something monumental was unfolding. Then came the moment that changed the atmosphere entirely. The bailiff opened a side door, and the sound of claws, clicking against polished tile, echoed through the chamber. A collective murmur ran across the courtroom as a large German shepherd entered, wearing the familiar harness of a police canine. His handler led him with steady confidence, but it was the dog himself who commanded the room. Broad-shouldered, dark-coated, with sharp, intelligent eyes, Rex had long been known as one of the most skilled dogs on the force. His reputation was one of bravery, his instincts sharper than many officers. But today, his role was different. The little girl's head jerked up. Her eyes widened, bright for the first time since she had walked into the building. Her grip on the stuffed bear loosened as she leaned forward in her chair, fixating on Rex with an intensity that startled her guardian. The dog's ears twitched, his steps slowing as though he, too, recognized her. He tilted his head, sniffed the air, and then, ignoring the handler's gentle tug, he stopped directly in front of her. It was a reunion no one had expected, but to the girl, it was everything. Months earlier, on the night of the crime, Rex had been the one who found her. He had pushed his way into that crumbling house after detecting her scent. When officers had shouted commands into the darkness, it was Rex who had crawled beneath the broken table, nudging her gently until she lifted her tear-streaked face. His warmth had calmed her when no words could. That moment had forged a silent bond between them, one that not even time or trauma could erase. Now, as the courtroom watched, the bond reignited. The child blinked once, then again, as if to make sure he was real. Slowly, she extended one tiny hand toward him. Her guardian froze, unsure whether to intervene, but Rex solved the dilemma himself. With remarkable gentleness, the massive dog lowered his head, pressing his nose against her palm, her fingers curled instinctively into his fur. For the first time in months, she exhaled a breath that didn't shake. The courtroom stilled, conversations halted. Even the judge, stern and accustomed to control, leaned forward, his expression softening. It was as though everyone knew they were witnessing something profound. The defense attorney adjusted his tie nervously, clearly unsettled by the scene. He had spent weeks preparing arguments about the unreliability of witnesses and the weakness of the prosecution's evidence. But what strategy could counter this? What words could dismantle the quiet connection between an innocent child and a loyal canine? The jurors, too, shifted uneasily. They had been prepared for evidence charts, testimonies, and legal jargon, not this raw display of trust and recognition. The little girl's guardian wiped away a tear, whispering her name softly, as if to encourage her, but no words came not yet. She simply held Rex's fur, her face calmer than anyone had seen in months. The dog sat proudly beside her chair, his body angled protectively toward her, his steady presence a living reminder of the night he saved her life. And in that silence, something shifted. The case that had seemed fragile suddenly had weight. The little girl wasn't just a bystander anymore. She was the heart of the story, the living proof that truth had a voice even if it hadn't yet spoken. The prosecutor cleared his throat, recognizing the shift in momentum. He didn't need to say much. The image of the child and the dog spoke louder than any opening statement ever could. Across the room, jurors exchanged glances, their expressions softening. Even the spectators, who had come seeking drama, sat hushed, moved by the unexpected tenderness of the moment. The defendant, however, was not unmoved. His jaw tightened, his fists clenched at his sides. For weeks he had leaned back in his chair, with smug defiance, but now, under the gaze of the child who had survived and the dog who had hunted him down, his composure faltered. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple. He looked away, but the silence of the room made his discomfort louder than words. No one knew it yet, but the trial had already begun to turn. For in that instant, the toddler was no longer voiceless. She hadn't spoken, but her presence spoke volumes. She had acknowledged her rescuer, chosen to reach for him in a room full of strangers, and silently declared where her trust belonged. The jury had seen it. The judge had seen it. Everyone had seen it. Gasps hadn't filled the room yet, not like they would later when her voice finally broke free. But in this quiet, charged moment, the foundation was laid. Something had awakened in her, and it wouldn't be long before her silence gave way to words that would echo across the courtroom. And as Rex settled at her side, eyes watchful, heart loyal, the world waited. The hush in the courtroom lingered long after Rex settled at the toddler's side. To the jurors, it looked like a simple reunion between a child and a dog. But to those who knew the story behind it, the sight carried far more weight. It was a glimpse into the fragile, unspoken bond that had formed months earlier on a night that still haunted detectives, prosecutors, and most of all the little girl. For the child, words had become impossible. Her world had been shattered too suddenly, too violently for her young mind to process. Psychologists called it selective mutism. To her guardian, it felt like her niece had disappeared into herself, building walls no one could climb. Every attempt to coax words from her ended the same, with silence, wide eyes, and the slow shake of a head. Nights were the hardest. The girl would wake screaming, clutching her stuffed bear, but even in fear she could not speak. All that emerged were small whimpers, sounds that broke hearts but gave no answers. And yet Rex had reached her. He hadn't used words, of course. He hadn't needed them. On that terrible night, when officers had stormed the decrepit house and scoured its rooms, it was Rex who slipped beneath the cracked furniture, where a faint whimper gave him pause. The child had been curled in the shadows, her body rigid, her wide eyes fixed on nothing. Humans frightened her, then strange voices, harsh lights, the chaos of officers rushing through. But Rex's nose pressed against her arm, warm and insistent, made her stir. His steady breath and gentle nudge told her what words couldn't, that she wasn't alone. That single moment had planted a seed of trust. In the weeks that followed, whenever the child was asked about the night of the crime, she turned away. Her lips sealed. Therapists tried dolls, drawings, even games, but nothing unlocked her voice. Yet when Rex visited the safe house where she stayed, everything changed. She would sit cross-legged on the floor, and the massive German shepherd would lie down in front of her, eyes calm, body still, as though he knew not to push too hard. Sometimes she would pat his fur. Sometimes she would lean against him silently, comforted by his presence. And though she never spoke, her guardian swore her breathing slowed, her trembling lessened, whenever Rex was near. It was no wonder, then, that the moment she saw him in the courtroom, her silence cracked, not into words yet, but into recognition. Her eyes brightened, her body leaned forward. It was a spark of life, proof that the walls she had built weren't indestructible. The prosecutors had planned to introduce Rex later as part of their narrative about how the child was rescued. But his mere entrance had already shifted the courtroom's atmosphere. Jurors whispered to each other when they thought no one noticed. Even the judge, known for his strict adherence to procedure, allowed the moment to linger, his gavel resting, untouched as he observed the scene. The defense, however, bristled. "This is theater," the defense attorney muttered under his breath, shuffling his notes. To him, the child's attachment to the dog was irrelevant. He had prepared arguments about lack of DNA evidence, about unreliable witness statements, about how the police had rushed the investigation. But no amount of legal strategy could erase the powerful sight of innocence finding comfort in loyalty. He could already feel the jury slipping away from him. The defendant shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening. He didn't like being ignored, and right now all eyes were on the child and the dog. The smug expression he had worn throughout much of the trial faltered. His lawyer leaned toward him, whispering furiously, but he barely responded. His gaze darted between the girl and Rex, a flicker of unease passing across his face. Meanwhile, the child reached for Rex again. Her fingers curled into his fur, tiny against his massive frame. He didn't flinch, didn't move, just let her hold him. Slowly, her breathing evened out, her posture relaxing as though she had found an anchor in the storm. To the casual observer, it was just a girl and a dog. To those in the room, it was something far more powerful, a silent testimony that spoke louder than words. The prosecutor stood, sensing the shift in energy. He walked toward the bench, careful not to disturb the moment, and addressed the court. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm, "what you're witnessing here is not theater. This bond is real. This child hasn't spoken in months. She's been locked in silence since the night of the crime. But look at her now. Look at the way she recognizes him, trusts him. This is the very same dog who found her, who stayed by her side when fear silenced her. If anything can help her break that silence, it's him." The judge studied the child again. Her small hand rested on Rex's neck, her expression soft yet focused. The courtroom had gone so still that even the sound of pages turning seemed loud. It was then that the girl did something no one expected. She let go of her stuffed bear. For months she had clung to that toy as though it were the only thing keeping her safe. She slept with it, carried it everywhere, and refused to release it even when doctors examined her. But now, in front of a room full of strangers, she set it gently on her lap and used both hands to hold on to Rex. It was a tiny gesture, but its meaning was enormous. She was shifting her trust. She was letting go of fear, piece by fragile piece, in favor of the comfort she felt from the dog. A murmur spread through the courtroom. One juror dabbed her eyes with a tissue. Another leaned forward, resting his chin on his hands, clearly moved. The prosecutor said nothing more. He didn't need to. The moment was speaking for itself. Her guardian sat beside her, tears glistening in her eyes. She had prayed for months that the little girl would find a way back to herself. And though the road ahead was long, this was the first step. She squeezed the child's shoulder gently, but the girl didn't turn. Her focus was on Rex, her silent protector. The defense attorney rose to object, his voice sharp, claiming the scene was manipulative and irrelevant. But his words fell flat. The jury wasn't looking at him. Neither was the judge. All eyes remained on the girl and the dog. Silent bonds, after all, can be louder than the most eloquent speech. And in that moment, though she hadn't yet spoken a word, the little girl had begun to testify, not with her voice, but with her trust. The question was no longer if she would speak. It was when. And when she finally did, the courtroom would never forget it. The courtroom was already heavy with tension, but as the proceedings dragged into their second day, that weight seemed to thicken. Jurors shifted in their chairs, scribbling notes they weren't sure they'd ever use. The prosecution's witnesses had testified, but their voices felt shaky, uncertain. The defense lawyer had poked holes in each account, leaving doubts scattered like shards of glass across the case. At times, it seemed the trial might slip through the prosecution's fingers. The defendant, leaning back with arms crossed, exuded confidence. He smirked when a witness stammered, chuckled under his breath when the prosecutor fumbled with documents. He thrived in doubt, and for a while, the courtroom seemed to bend in his favor. But then the child stirred. Until that moment, she had sat motionless, her guardian at her side, Rex curled protectively at her feet. Her small hands rested in his fur, her stuffed bear forgotten on the bench. No one expected her to play a role. The court had been assured she was too young, too fragile, too silent to contribute. She was there because she had lived it, but no one thought she would reveal it. Yet now, in the middle of the defense attorney's cross-examination of an officer, the girl shifted in her seat. It wasn't much at first. Just a lean forward, a subtle movement that caught her guardian's eye. The guardian frowned, whispering her name softly, but the girl didn't respond. Instead, she pulled her hand from Rex's fur and placed it in her lap, her tiny back straightening, her eyes fixed on the defendant. It was such a sudden change that even the prosecutor noticed, mid-sentence. His voice faltered. The defense lawyer paused too, following the direction of her gaze. The jury turned in unison, their eyes landing on the little girl whose silence had been as much a part of the case as any evidence. She was truly staring for the first time. The defendant, caught off guard, shifted uncomfortably. His smirk faltered. He raised his chin, as though trying to appear unbothered, but a bead of sweat betrayed him, trailing down his temple. And then the girl moved again. Slowly, deliberately, she released her guardian's hand and reached once more for Rex. The dog's ears twitched. He lifted his head, watching her intently, as if waiting for a command. The child's fingers curled into his fur, but her gaze never left the defendant. The room went silent. The defense attorney froze, mouth open mid-word. The prosecutor stepped back from the podium, his papers forgotten. Even the judge, who rarely allowed distractions, lowered his pen and leaned forward. Everyone could feel that something monumental was about to happen. The child's lips parted slightly. It was almost imperceptible at first, a faint tremor of movement. Her guardian gasped softly, her hand hovering protectively near the girl's shoulder, unsure whether to stop her or let her continue. The prosecutor dared not speak. He knew that any sound, any interruption, might shatter the fragile courage that seemed to be building in the child. The jurors leaned in, hearts pounding. The gallery of spectators, which had been restless moments before, sat frozen in anticipation. Even the reporters, pens poised over their notebooks, forgot to write. The silence stretched unbearably. Seconds felt like minutes, the weight of expectation pressing down on every person in the room. Rex shifted slightly, his body angled closer to the child. His tail didn't wag, his ears didn't flick. He was utterly still, as though he too understood the gravity of the moment. His eyes locked on hers, a steady presence guiding her through the storm. The child blinked, her small mouth opening wider this time. Her throat moved, her chest rising with a breath that shook but didn't break. Her guardian whispered again, her voice trembling, "Sweetheart, it's okay." And then came the faintest sound. It wasn't a word, not yet. Just a tiny exhale shaped by her lips, fragile and wavering, but enough to make the courtroom gasp collectively. She closed her mouth again, cheeks flushing with effort, then tried once more. The defense attorney sputtered an objection, but the judge silenced him with a single sharp glance. No one would interrupt this moment. The girl's eyes glistened with tears, but her gaze never wavered from the man at the defense table. Her tiny chest rose again, her fingers clinging tighter to Rex's fur, drawing strength from his solid presence. And then her voice broke. Free. The first syllable was soft, almost lost in the silence. The second was clearer, steadier. By the third, everyone knew she was speaking. The courtroom held its breath. The prosecutor's hands shook as he clutched his notes, though he no longer needed them. Jurors sat rigid, leaning forward as though afraid to miss a single sound. Reporters' pens scratched desperately across their notepads now, each stroke capturing history in the making. The defendant paled. His composure cracked, his lips tightening into a thin line. He shifted in his chair, his eyes darting around the room, searching for anything to anchor him. But every gaze was locked on the girl. And still, she spoke. Her words were halting, fragile, each one carrying the weight of months of silence. Yet with every sound, her voice grew steadier, stronger, as though Rex's presence lent her the courage she needed. The judge's eyes softened, though his expression remained composed. He knew this was uncharted ground. Legally, it was delicate. But as a human, as a father and grandfather, he recognized the sheer power of what was happening. The silence broke only with the girl's voice. And when she finally managed to form her first true words, the room erupted, not with noise, but with a collective gasp so loud it seemed to shake the walls. Gasps that echoed, reverberating with disbelief, awe, and emotion. The court had held its breath. Now the world inhaled again, knowing nothing would be the same, because innocence had spoken, and the truth was finally beginning to emerge. The sound of the child's trembling voice seemed to hang in the air long after her lips stopped moving. For months, no one had heard her speak. To hear even a whisper was like watching dawn break after the longest, darkest night. But the courtroom wanted more. They needed more. Every eye was locked on her, a fragile girl whose silence had carried as much weight as any sworn testimony. She clutched Rex's fur tighter, her knuckles pale from the effort. The German shepherd remained utterly still, ears perked, his sharp gaze fixed on her as if he understood exactly what was happening. His presence steadied her. Where her guardian's comforting hand had failed, Rex's silent strength gave her courage. The prosecutor dared not move. The defense attorney opened his mouth to object, but the judge lifted a single hand, silencing him with a look. No one would interrupt this moment. The girl's lips parted again, her breath shuddering. Her chest rose and fell with the weight of the memory pressing inside her. She glanced toward the defendant, her tiny face tight with fear, and then quickly back to Rex. The dog's dark eyes met hers, steady, loyal, unwavering, and then she spoke. 2 words, just 2. But they cut through the courtroom like a blade. Bad man. The words were soft, trembling, but clear enough that every juror, every spectator, every lawyer heard them. Gasps rippled through the room, sharp and collective. A woman in the gallery clapped a hand over her mouth. One juror reached for a tissue, tears brimming in her eyes. The defendant's smug confidence shattered instantly. His jaw slackened, his face draining of color. He sat frozen, staring at the child as though she had ripped away the mask he'd been wearing all along. For weeks, he had smiled, smirked, and scoffed at the accusations. But 2 words from a toddler had done what hours of testimony and reams of evidence had failed to do. They pierced through the doubt. And then Rex barked. Just once. Loud, commanding, undeniable. It echoed off the walls like a gavel strike, as if the dog himself was affirming her words. The bark startled the jurors, who instinctively sat straighter. It startled the defense attorney, who fumbled with his papers, stammering for control. It startled even the judge, who blinked behind his glasses, though his composure quickly returned. The child flinched at the sound, but did not let go of Rex. Instead, she buried her face against his fur for a moment, finding refuge in his steadiness before lifting her head again. Her small hand remained tangled in his coat, a lifeline that tethered her to courage. "Bad man?" she repeated, this time louder, steadier. The courtroom gasped again, though softer this time. The shock had passed, replaced by awe and dawning realization. A 3-year-old, silent for months, had broken her silence not with confusion, not with nonsense, but with a clear accusation. The prosecutor's eyes burned with emotion. He stepped forward, careful not to overshadow the girl, and addressed the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice trembling despite his best efforts. "This child has been silent since the night of the crime. She has refused to speak to doctors, to her guardian, even to me. And yet here, today, in front of the man she remembers, she found her voice." The defense attorney shot up, furious. "Objection," he barked. "This is inadmissible. She's 3 years old. She doesn't understand what she's saying. This is... The judge silenced him with a bang of the gavel. "Sit down, counselor, now." The defense attorney obeyed reluctantly, his face flushed with anger, his words cut short. But the damage was already done. The jury had seen too much. They had seen the child's fear, her determination, her recognition of the man who had haunted, her nightmares. They had heard her voice, fragile yet powerful. The defendant shifted uncomfortably, his hands twitching in his lap. His eyes darted from the jury to the judge to the little girl. For the first time in weeks, he looked small, vulnerable, afraid. The child's guardian pulled her close, tears streaming down her face. She whispered praise in the girl's ear-soft encouragements, words of love and pride, but the child kept her eyes fixed on Rex. It was to him that she had spoken first, to him that she had entrusted her truth. And Rex sat proudly, chest lifted, eyes fierce, as though he understood the role he had played. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, the energy electric. Reporters scribbled furiously, pens flying across notepads, capturing the moment that would dominate headlines by nightfall. But in the center of it all, the little girl sat quietly again, exhausted but unburdened. Her silence had broken, and in those 2 words, she had said more than most could in hours of testimony. The judge, his expression softened despite his rigid posture, leaned forward. "Let the record show," he said solemnly, "that the child has identified the defendant with the words 'bad man.'" The defense attorney groaned audibly, but he knew as well as everyone else. There was no undoing this. 2 words had shifted the course of the trial. 2 words had pierced through doubt, excuses, and legal maneuvering. 2 words had given the jury something no chart, no report, no testimony had managed to provide certainty. And though the trial was far from over, the momentum had changed forever. The courtroom had held its breath, waiting for the impossible. And the impossible had just happened. The courtroom remained charged with tension, the echoes of the toddler's 2 words still lingering in the minds of everyone present. Bad man. 2 words so fragile, so small, yet they struck harder than any legal argument could. Every person in that room felt the weight of what had just happened. The jurors leaned forward in their chairs, some clutching their notepads, some rubbing their eyes in disbelief. Even seasoned reporters, accustomed to covering crime and courtroom drama, whispered quietly among themselves, awed by the courage of a 3-year-old who had spoken when words had seemed impossible. The prosecutor, sensing the shift, rose slowly from his chair. His hands were steady now, not with fear but with purpose. Every eye in the courtroom turned toward him. He didn't need to overstate what had just occurred. The child had already spoken. Her voice had already changed the atmosphere. Yet there was one more crucial piece of the puzzle that needed to be highlighted. The dog, Rex. He cleared his throat. Your Honor, members of the jury, what you have just witnessed is remarkable. But it is not merely emotion. It is evidence. Rex, this police canine, is not just a companion to this child. He is a trained officer with a proven ability to track, detect, and protect. On the night of the crime, Rex located this child in an abandoned house. He protected her when the suspect threatened her safety. And today, he is here not only as a witness of circumstance, but as a silent guardian validating the child's account. He let his words hang in the room, allowing them to sink in. The jury could see it plainly. The bond between the girl and Rex was no accident. It was forged in fear, in survival, in trust that had never wavered. The defense attorney rose immediately, trying to interject, his voice sharp with frustration. Objection, Your Honor. The dog cannot testify. A canine has no legal standing. The judge slammed his gavel lightly, cutting him off. Sit down. The dog's actions are not testimony in words, but in fact. The court will consider them accordingly. The attorney sat reluctantly, his face flushed with frustration. But even he could not deny the impression Rex had made. The prosecutor continued, pacing slowly now, commanding the room's attention without raising his voice. Consider what happened that night. Officers searched every corner of the house, but it was Rex who found her. He navigated debris, darkness, and danger to locate this terrified child. Without him, we might not have had a witness at all. Rex's actions directly led to the apprehension of the suspect. And now, he gestured toward the little girl. You have seen the culmination of that bond. The child has spoken, identifying the man she remembers as threatening her. And Rex, her protector, sits by her side, affirming her courage. The gallery was silent. Even whispers had ceased. People sat, captivated by the story unfolding before them. No one had expected a dog to play such a pivotal role in a criminal trial, yet here it was, undeniable and real. Rex shifted slightly, adjusting his posture as though to demonstrate his alertness. The child's tiny hand rested on his fur, steady now, as though she had drawn all the courage she would ever need from him. She looked up at him, her eyes full of trust. And the courtroom knew, in that silent exchange, that this dog had indeed been more than an animal. He had been a witness, a protector, a guide. The prosecutor paused, allowing the moment to resonate. Then he addressed the jury directly. Members of the jury, sometimes truth comes not from words alone, but from actions. You have seen the child's fear, her hesitation, and now her courage. You have seen Rex, who protected her, guided her, and helped her find her voice. This is the evidence you cannot dismiss. He stepped back, letting the words sink in. Some jurors dabbed their eyes. Some leaned forward with tightened grips on their chairs. There was no denying what they had witnessed. The proof was in. The bond, the gestures, the courage of a child and a dog together. The defense attorney rose again, desperation creeping into his voice. This is highly prejudicial. You're appealing to emotion. A toddler cannot identify a criminal. A dog is a dog. This is nonsense, and it should not influence your judgment. A juror's whisper cut through the room. It's not nonsense. She knows, and he knows. The whisper was soft, yet it carried through the chamber like a statement of fact. The defense attorney faltered, losing momentum as the jury's attention drifted entirely to the girl and Rex. The judge, recognizing the power of the moment, allowed a brief recess. During the pause, the child leaned against Rex, her little hand stroking his fur. Reporters snapped photos. Jurors watched quietly, and the defendant slumped in his chair, pale and anxious. The gallery was a mixture of curiosity and awe. No one spoke. They simply observed. After the recess, the prosecutor returned to the podium. Your Honor, members of the jury, let me be clear. Rex is not merely a dog. He is a trained police officer whose actions saved a life. And today, he bears witness to the truth. You have seen how the child, after months of silence, has found her voice in his presence. That voice, combined with his actions, points clearly to the man who threatened her safety. The courtroom seemed suspended in time. The defense lawyer attempted to respond, but his voice sounded hollow against the overwhelming visual evidence. The child and the dog, united, silent, yet screaming the truth in every gesture. The defendant's hands shook, barely perceptible, but noticeable to the jury. He had relied on doubt to carry him this far. But doubt was no longer possible, not in the presence of a child who had survived, who had remembered, and who had now spoken. Guided by the steady loyalty of Rex, the judge observed quietly, making notes but not interfering. This was beyond procedure. It was human. And even in his decades of experience, he could not deny the significance of what had happened. The child's guardian whispered softly, comforting her niece, brushing tears from her cheek. The girl remained calm, reassured by Rex's unwavering presence. She was small, but in that moment, she was powerful. Her voice had begun to pierce the darkness of fear and trauma. The prosecutor concluded, his tone firm and unwavering. Ladies and gentlemen, the facts are clear. Rex's actions saved a child's life. The child's identification, guided by Rex, confirms the suspect's presence and intent. You are not being asked to guess, to speculate, or to imagine. You are being asked to recognize the courage and truth before you. This dog and this child together are proof that the defendant is guilty of the crime he committed. The jury absorbed every word, but it was the visual, silent truth that carried the most weight. No paper evidence, no witness testimony, no chart could ever rival the bond between a child and her dog. Even the spectators were moved. Mothers glanced at their children in the gallery. Reporters whispered among themselves, and the entire room seemed to recognize that justice was being served in a most unusual, yet undeniable, way. And Rex, obedient and steadfast, seemed to understand. His eyes swept the room, observing, alert, protective. He was more than a witness. He was a hero. The little girl's fingers remained in his fur, drawing courage and reassurance from his steady presence. By the end of the day, it was clear. The dog's role had become central to the trial. Not as a novelty, not as an emotional ploy, but as a crucial piece of evidence, the living, breathing proof of survival, fear, and ultimate truth. The defendant sat frozen, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like never before. For weeks, he had relied on fear and confusion to protect him. But here, in the gaze of a child and the presence of a dog, those defenses crumbled. 2. Witnesses, silent in their own ways, had become the most powerful force in the courtroom. And the trial would never be the same again. The courtroom had fallen into an uneasy hush as the prosecutor concluded his arguments, leaving the gravity of the situation to settle on every person present. For hours, the events of the trial had escalated beyond legal procedure into something far more human. The child had spoken, breaking months of silence, guided by Rex, the police dog who had saved her. Every movement, every glance, every trembling syllable of her tiny voice seemed to carry more weight than reams of evidence ever could. And yet, the judge remained troubled, wrestling with a dilemma that went beyond mere procedure. He had seen courts filled with drama, witnesses crumble under pressure, and evidence presented in meticulous detail. But rarely, if ever, had he faced a moment where the truth seemed to manifest itself not on paper, but in human and canine presence. The law demanded objectivity, proof, and admissibility. But here, the evidence was both tangible and intangible, emotional and factual, delicate yet undeniable. The judge leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as the defense attorney muttered frantically beside him, "Your Honor, this is unprecedented. A toddler's testimony should not carry weight. And a dog? A dog cannot provide legal testimony." The judge raised a hand, silencing him, his mind racing. He understood the law, yet he could not ignore the events before him. The child had identified the defendant, her words trembling but clear. The dog had found her, guided the authorities, and now, by his presence, provided a silent affirmation of her words. Could he dismiss this? Could he pretend that what he had witnessed, the bond, the trust, the courage, did not carry evidentiary significance? He glanced toward the defendant, who sat rigid, fingers drumming nervously on the arm of his chair. The man's composure had eroded entirely since the toddler first spoke, his smugness replaced with panic and uncertainty. The judge could feel the room holding its collective breath, the tension thick as fog. Jurors had become invested, not only in the facts of the case, but in the human story unfolding before them. This was no longer merely about crime and punishment. It was about courage, survival, and the undeniable connection between the innocent and the protector. The judge sighed, recalling his own experiences with cases involving children. He had presided over many trials, but he had never encountered one where the young victim's voice was so hesitant, so fragile, yet so compelling. The law acknowledged child witnesses, yes, but rarely one so young, and never one so traumatized. He had consulted experts before, weighing testimony and evaluating reliability. And yet now, in the courtroom, all that preparation felt secondary to what his eyes were witnessing. The child shifted in her seat, resting her small hand on Rex's fur. She was exhausted, her tiny body trembling with the effort of having spoken. But she remained composed enough to maintain eye contact with the dog, drawing strength from his presence. Rex, in turn, remained unwavering, alert and protective. He was more than a dog. He was a participant, a living extension of truth, his instincts guiding both the child and the court toward clarity. The judge glanced toward the jury. Their faces were pale, their expressions tense. Some were visibly moved, tears welling in their eyes, while others stared in awe at the simplicity and power of the moment. They weren't just considering evidence. They were witnessing courage manifested, trust proven, and loyalty embodied. Could he, in good conscience, ignore what they had just experienced? He returned his gaze to the defendant, whose panic was now palpable. The man's eyes darted around the room, his body stiff and unresponsive. For weeks he had believed he could manipulate doubt, twist the narrative, and rely on technicalities. But now, confronted with the raw, undeniable truth, the child's courage and the dog's presence, he had no defenses left. The law was precise, but human perception was powerful, and in this courtroom, perception had shifted irrevocably. The defense attorney pressed his case, but the words seemed hollow against the unfolding scene. He attempted to argue about the unreliability of the toddler's identification, about the inadmissibility of a dog's presence as proof. But the judge could see through it. The child's trauma had been real, her silence authentic, and her eventual words undeniable. Rex's presence had not coerced her. It had enabled her to convey the truth safely. To dismiss it would be to ignore the very essence of justice, truth. The judge took a deep breath, considering the legal implications. He thought about how history would remember this trial, not merely as a criminal proceeding, but as a story of courage and loyalty. How could he navigate between the rigidity of the law and the undeniable evidence of human experience before him? How could he honor the legal framework while respecting the profound bond that had emerged between child and dog? He leaned forward, tapping his gavel gently, drawing the courtroom's attention. "We are in uncharted territory," he began, his voice calm but resolute. "This court acknowledges the extraordinary circumstances of this case. The child has been silent for months, unable to testify in traditional ways. Yet her identification of the defendant, supported by the actions of the police dog, Rex, cannot be dismissed lightly. It is a unique situation where human and animal have together provided insight into the truth." The room was silent, hanging on his every word. Jurors leaned forward, reporters scribbled furiously, and even the defendant slumped, knowing he could not escape the reality of the moment. The judge continued, weighing his words carefully. While the law provides specific parameters for admissible testimony, this case demonstrates that sometimes truth emerges in ways we cannot predict. It is the responsibility of this court to consider the credibility of the evidence presented before us, including the child's identification, the circumstances of her silence, and the role of Rex in facilitating her courage. He paused, letting the weight of his statement settle. Everyone in the courtroom seemed to exhale collectively. Even the little girl, exhausted from the strain of speaking, glanced up at the judge, her expression calm, reassured by Rex at her side. The defense attorney's protests had dwindled to mutters, his strategy crumbling under the undeniable clarity of the scene. The jurors had seen the fear, the courage, and the bond. The defendant could no longer rely on doubt alone. He was exposed, revealed in a way words and arguments could no longer shield him. The judge's gaze softened as he looked at the child and the dog. He could not ignore what had happened, nor could he reduce it to mere emotion. This was evidence, but it was evidence born of trust, courage, and survival. He was aware that history might judge this trial differently, but justice demanded that he honor what he had witnessed, that he weigh both law and truth, logic and human reality. Finally, he spoke, directing the court's attention with authority. The testimony and identification of this child, combined with the actions of Rex, will be considered valid for the purposes of this trial. The court recognizes the extraordinary circumstances and the unique role that both the child and the dog have played in bringing the facts of this case to light. It is now up to the jury to weigh this evidence and determine its significance. The room remained silent, heavy with the emotion and gravity of the moment. Even the defendant seemed paralyzed, caught between fear and disbelief. The jurors exchanged glances, their responsibility now clearer than ever. They had been entrusted with the most unusual, yet compelling, evidence they might ever encounter. As the court recessed briefly, the little girl leaned into Rex, her hand clutching his fur with quiet relief. For months, she had carried fear and silence. Now, supported by the steadfast presence of her protector, she had begun to reclaim her voice. And while the judge faced legal dilemmas and questions of admissibility, the undeniable truth remained. Courage and loyalty had prevailed. In that courtroom, law and humanity had collided. The child and the dog had together illuminated the path to justice. And the judge, despite his years of experience, recognized that sometimes the law must adapt to the extraordinary. For the first time in months, the courtroom felt not just tense or anticipatory, but alive with the possibility of justice, real, tangible, and undeniable. The courtroom emptied slowly, leaving behind a tension so thick it seemed to cling to the walls. Jurors filed out one by one, their faces pale, eyes wide with the weight of what they had witnessed. In the jury room, the air was heavy, almost suffocating. Each seat was occupied, yet the room felt claustrophobic, not from the number of bodies, but from the gravity of the responsibility they now bore. The trial had been unlike any other. Witnesses had testified, evidence had been presented, and legal arguments had been laid out in meticulous detail. But nothing had compared to the extraordinary scene they had just witnessed. A 3-year-old child, silent for months, speaking for the first time, guided by the unwavering presence of a police dog named Rex. 2 simple words had shattered doubt. Bad man. Jurors shifted nervously in their chairs. One leaned forward, elbows on the table, pressing her fingers to her forehead. I can't stop thinking about her, she said softly. She was so tiny, and yet so brave. Another juror, a man, with graying hair, nodded slowly. It's not just her courage, he said, voice quiet. It's the dog. You can't ignore what he did. He found her, protected her, and helped her speak. That's real evidence. A third juror leaned back, arms crossed. I've been on juries before, she said, but I've never felt anything like this. This isn't just about facts anymore. It's about truth you can see, truth you can feel. The debate began cautiously, each juror balancing reason with emotion. The defense team had tried to dismiss the child's words and the dog's presence as irrelevant. But now, faced with the undeniable scene, the jurors struggled to reconcile legal definitions with reality. One juror spoke sharply. We can't let emotions decide. She's a toddler. How can we be sure she understood what she said? How do we know she wasn't just repeating something she'd been prompted to say? Another juror countered immediately. Look at her. She's not repeating anything. She recognized him. And the dog Rex, he's not just standing there for show. He's a trained officer. He confirmed everything without a word. That counts for something. The discussion grew more intense as they considered the evidence in its entirety. For weeks, the defendant had relied on doubt, on loopholes, on the lack of concrete proof. But what they had just seen was more than proof. It was undeniable truth manifested in courage and loyalty. A juror, the quietest of the group, spoke at last. We've seen the child's fear, her silence, and now her voice, and Rex. We've seen how he guided her. You can't argue with that. This is evidence we understand, even if it's not conventional. The debate continued late into the afternoon, jurors weighing each piece of evidence, recalling witness statements, and replaying the courtroom scene in their minds. They considered the officers' reports, forensic evidence, and the defendant's suspicious behavior. But in every mind, the image of the child, small and trembling yet speaking clearly, anchored the discussion. Hours passed, and the jurors began to edge closer to consensus. They revisited every detail, every gesture, every nuance of that extraordinary testimony. The child's trembling voice, the unwavering presence of Rex, the defendant's growing panic, it all pointed to a single conclusion. Yet doubt lingered, as it always does in cases of extreme emotion. One juror raised concerns about relying too heavily on a child's memory or a dog's instincts. But even as they debated, no one could deny the courage the toddler had displayed, the trust she had placed in Rex, and the clarity of her identification. Finally, a vote was called. One by one, the jurors expressed their decision, each voice tentative at first, then firmer as the realization settled in. The evidence, unconventional as it was undeniable. The child had spoken, the dog had acted, and the defendant had no credible defense left. When the final vote was cast, unanimity had been achieved. Guilty. Every juror without hesitation agreed. The weight of months of investigation, fear, trauma, and courage had been resolved in that single word, echoed silently in their hearts, guilty. The foreperson, a tall man with a calm demeanor, stood and addressed the judge. Your Honor, we have reached a unanimous verdict. We find the defendant guilty on all counts. A collective sigh of relief swept through the room. Outside the jury room, spectators whispered in awe. Reporters jotted down notes furiously, and even the courtroom staff allowed themselves a brief smile. Justice, in its most unusual and emotional form, had prevailed. Back in the courtroom, the judge's expression softened as the jurors filed back in. The little girl sat beside Rex, her tiny hand resting on his fur. She had watched the deliberations from the gallery, her small face calm yet expectant. She had spoken her truth. Now the jury had confirmed it. The prosecutor stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Your Honor, this verdict confirms what we have witnessed over the course of this trial. The child's bravery, combined with Rex's actions, has ensured that justice is served. The defense attorney lowered his head, defeated, understanding that no argument could undo what had been proven in the most remarkable human way possible. The defendant's face fell completely, his earlier arrogance replaced by fear and despair. He realized, too late, that no legal maneuvering could overcome. The truth manifested through courage, instinct, and loyalty. The courtroom felt almost reverent as the judge addressed the child. You have shown great courage, young lady. Your words have helped us all see the truth. The child looked at Rex, then back at the judge, her eyes shining with the trust and pride she had gained. She had done it. She had spoken. She had been heard, and she had helped bring justice to light. Rex, as always, remained calm, his dark eyes attentive, his presence unwavering. He had fulfilled his role without ceremony, without recognition. But everyone in the courtroom understood. He had been more than a dog. He had been a protector, a guide, and a silent force for justice. The verdict had been read, and the courtroom slowly began to empty. But the story of the child and her dog would linger, not just in the minds of those present, but in the hearts of all who would hear it in the days and years to come. The little girl, exhausted but proud, rested her head on Rex's back. She had spoken for herself, for justice, and for the memory of the fear she had endured. And in that quiet, unassuming gesture, the room understood the depth of the bond that had carried her through darkness to light. Outside the courtroom, the city continued its rhythm, unaware of the extraordinary courage that had transpired within those walls. But for those who had witnessed it, the story would not be forgotten. It was a story of fear and trust, silence and voice, danger and loyalty. It was a story that proved that even the smallest among us, guided by love and protection, could wield power that no adult, no law, and no criminal could dismiss. And in the center of it all, a little girl and a dog had changed the course of a life, a courtroom, and the lives of all who had witnessed their courage. The gavel fell one last time, echoing through the courtroom like the final note of a long, tense symphony. The verdict of guilty had been read aloud, and the air seemed lighter, yet charged with the raw emotions of the trial that had just ended. Jurors filed out quietly, their faces pale but relieved, some still wiping tears from their eyes. They had witnessed something extraordinary. A child's courage and a dog's loyalty had brought justice in a way no one could have predicted. Outside the courtroom, the city moved on, but for those involved, nothing would ever feel ordinary again. Reporters swarmed, eager to capture the story of the 3-year-old girl and Rex, the police K-9, whose silent vigilance had shaped the trial. Photographs were taken, interviews were conducted, and yet no article, no headline, could ever fully convey the depth of what had transpired. The little girl remained seated beside Rex, her hand resting in his thick fur. Her guardian knelt beside her, gently brushing stray strands of hair from her face. "You were so brave," she whispered, voice trembling with relief and pride. The girl didn't respond immediately, but her eyes met Rex's, and a soft, contented sigh escaped her lips. That simple gesture spoke volumes. She had survived. She had spoken. She had helped bring justice. Rex, calm as ever, remained by her side. His body was a comforting presence, his steady gaze a silent reminder of safety and trust. The bond between child and dog had grown stronger than anyone could have anticipated. He had been her protector through fear, her anchor through silence, and her guide back into a world that had once seemed terrifying. The defendant was led away, his defeat absolute. His carefully constructed facade of control had crumbled, undone by 2 simple words and a dog's loyalty. Even as he was escorted out of the courtroom, his eyes lingered on the girl, filled with the helplessness of a man finally confronted with truth. For the little girl, though, the world had begun to feel safe again. The trauma that had kept her silent for months had not disappeared, but it had been pierced by courage, protection, and the justice that now seemed tangible. Every time she reached for Rex, she felt strength surge through her. His fur was a shield, his eyes a mirror of understanding. Together, they had survived, and together, they had triumphed. In the days that followed, the courtroom story spread nationwide. Headlines celebrated the bravery of the child and the remarkable role of the police dog. Families everywhere were inspired by the tale of courage and loyalty. But for the girl and her guardian, the real work had just begun: healing. Therapy sessions were introduced gradually. The child was encouraged to speak about her fears, her memories, and her feelings in a safe environment. At first, words came slowly, like fragile petals unfurling in sunlight. But with Rex by her side, her voice grew stronger. The dog remained, her constant companion, offering silent reassurance through every trembling syllable. Therapists marveled at the bond, noting how his presence helped her articulate emotions that had been trapped in silence. Her guardian watched with awe and relief. "You did it," she said one morning, brushing her fingers through the child's hair as they sat together with Rex. "You found your voice. You were so brave." The child leaned into Rex, resting her head on his warm back. She didn't need to answer. Her calm, steady gaze said it all. Meanwhile, Rex received recognition from his department. He was awarded a commendation for his role in the child's rescue and his pivotal presence during the trial. The ceremony was simple but poignant. The little girl watched from the front row, her tiny hand resting on Rex's fur as officers praised his dedication and bravery. She beamed, proud of her protector, her friend, her hero. Life slowly returned to routine. The girl's days were filled with school, play, and small adventures, but she was no longer defined by fear. The bond she shared with Rex remained the anchor of her life, a constant reminder of safety, trust, and courage. Every time she faced a challenge, whether a scraped knee or a stormy night, Rex was there, a silent witness to her bravery. The courtroom, too, became a memory of triumph. The judge reflected on the case often, marveling at the unusual but undeniable truth revealed within those walls. Legal precedent had been stretched, human emotion had been validated, and yet justice had been served in the most profound way. He sometimes smiled quietly to himself, recalling the child's first words, and the unwavering gaze of Rex that had changed the course of the trial. Years later, the story continued to inspire. Books were written, documentaries produced, and the tale of the child and the police dog became a touchstone for courage, trust, and the extraordinary power of loyalty. But for those who had lived it, the child, her guardian, and Rex, the story was not about fame or recognition. It was about survival, love, and the unbreakable bond that had carried them through darkness into light. The child, now more confident and expressive, often recounted small portions of her experience. She spoke to schoolmates about bravery, to family about trust, and to Rex, in her own quiet way, about gratitude. And Rex, ever vigilant, never left her side. He was more than a dog. He was a guardian, a friend, and a living reminder that courage could come in all shapes and sizes, even from the smallest among us. In the evenings, when the city outside was quiet, the girl would sit on the porch with Rex lying beside her. She would rest her tiny hand on his fur, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. Memories of fear and silence still lingered in corners of her mind, but with each passing day, those shadows grew smaller. She had spoken, she had been heard, she had survived, and she had done it with Rex by her side. The courtroom drama, the trial, the verdict, it all became part of a larger story of healing. The child and the dog had shown the world that courage could manifest in silence, that loyalty could guide truth, and that even the smallest voice could alter the course of justice. And as they watched the sun dip below the horizon, casting golden light across the porch, the girl whispered softly to Rex, "We did it, didn't we?" Rex nudged her hand gently with his nose, eyes steady and warm. In that quiet, unspoken moment, they both knew the answer. Together, they had faced fear, spoken truth, and emerged stronger. And together, they would face whatever came next. The story of courage, loyalty, and justice had ended in the courtroom, but in the lives of the child and her dog, it was only the beginning.